We're going to continue our reading of the book that will forever change our ideas about the Bible by Mauro Biglino. I started reading into this book I think almost a year ago, and we left off at the part where it was talking about how Enlil decided to use a natural event that was about to occur in order to erase the Adam, which is the humans, the genetically modified humans, and then so that would be the biblical flood, the flood myth that's found in just about every culture all around the world. So according to his translations, this was intentional by Enlil. So okay, let's get into the next part here. This next part is just titled "The Flood." So it says the Anunnaki knew of the immense and inevitable disaster that was about to strike the Earth. The gravitational force exerted by the proximity of Nibiru was causing the polar cap to shift. Disastrous consequences were about to affect the entire planet. This event was worldwide, or the worldwide known flood, happened about 13,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The Anunnaki already knew about it, and Enlil took advantage of this opportunity to achieve his goal at the expense of humanity. He decided to temporarily leave the planet without altering humankind, condemning them all to extinction along with all of the animals inhabiting the planet. In fact, the quote-unquote gods left on their ships and returned only when the flood waters receded. In the Book of Mormon, there is an interesting part where it talks about them creating like a disc-shaped vehicle that could go underwater, and I'm wondering if that has some kind of connection to this. Most likely it does. We said, however, that Enlil, the creator of humankind, loved his creatures, or excuse me, Enki, the creator, loved his creatures, and driven by this feeling, decided to save at least some of them. He therefore warned one man, and in parentheses it says, Uta Napishtim, which is the Sumerian version of quote-unquote Noah, of the imminent, so Enki warned Noah of the imminent danger and gave him the necessary instructions to rescue himself, his family, and some animals that would be useful to their survival. Enki knew that after a time, the normal conditions of life would reestablish. Thus, quote-unquote God, Enki, provided Utanapishtim the building plans and instructions on how to build an ark that could preserve the human species from the impending disaster. It is curious to note how the Bible's editors, anxious to affirm the oneness of God, have revisited this conflict between two gods by turning it into sort of an inner conflict experienced by one God, and that's referring to Genesis chapter 6. He decides to wipe humanity off the earth, but then has a second thought of finally choosing to redeem one or just one pure man who had found his favor and with whom he made a new pact. Now it says Noah's presence. This man is present in the myths from all over the world, variously named Noah in the Bible, Utnapishtim by the Babylonian epos of Gilgamesh. I think it's meant to say Epic of Gilgamesh. The Zira Sudra to the Sumerians, Cox to the Aztecs, Powako to the Indians from Delaware, Manu Yayavasata to the Hindustan, these words are really hard to pronounce. Dwaitach to the Celts, Zka in Patagonia, Noah to the inhabitants of the Amazon, Nu'u in Hawaii, Nuwa to the Chinese, Curiously, all with the similar pronunciations. Egyptians attribute to Thoth the desire to erase humanity. In the Book of the Dead, God says, I will erase all things I created. The earth will collapse into the abyss of the waters, whence the flood comes, and will then return peaceful as the beginning. The whole of humanity understands this event recorded for the first time by the Sumerians, those who had the privilege of walking with the quote-unquote gods and living with them. The people who, after the end of their time, also received the instruments to proceed along the path of humankind with civilizations and cultural evolution. Let's continue now with our brief summary. After the flood, the course of human evolution goes on. The quote-unquote gods established new cities and new command centers. They made important land reclamations in order to make some parts of the territory habitable and usable. They created elevated places free from mud, the same name in Egyptian means elevated land, and they divided the world into spheres of influence attributed to the different children of the Lord of the Empire. There are three main areas there are three main areas of development where archaeology has found proof of the existence of major human civilizations: Lower Mesopotamia, in parentheses Sumer, the Nile Valley, and the Indus Valley. A fourth area referred to as sacred that was dedicated was reserved for the Anunnaki, therefore Adams could not access it. This area was probably corresponding to the current Sinai. The Egyptian myths of the origins tell that Ptah, which is the name of the Egyptian origins, not the Semitics, came from quote-unquote beyond the sea. The Red Sea Strait, also called Ta Netura, or the land of the guardians, was the land of the primordial quote-unquote gods known as the Tilmun, that Sitchin translates as the place of the flying machines. In short, it was the new space station built to replace the previous one, which was destroyed by the flood, with its headquarters in Jerusalem. Jerusalem thus became the world's center, the target of the missions on planet Earth, where at the time of Abraham reigned Melchizedek, the king of justice, the righteous king, as written in Genesis chapter 14. In these new settlements, the Anunnaki chose some Adams to govern in their stead and began to pass on part of their scientific, botanical, and astronomical knowledge. Coincidentally, Sumerians say that long after the flood, the command center was brought to Earth around 3670 BC, which is when the Sumerian days computation and the Jewish calendar actually begin. Thus, the priest-king caste was born made of especially skilled people chosen by the Anunnaki to reign over the Adams. Originally, these were semi-gods, individuals in whose veins were flowing with Anunnaki blood, the children of the union between the Adams and the gods. So that's like where you get all the mythology of like the half man, half god figures, and in all the like Greek mythology and stuff like that. And that's also where we get the bloodline, the 13 bloodline families, the royal bloodlines. This is where it all comes from. They acquired their power from knowledge which was transferred to only a few. These semi-gods were meant to be intermediaries between Anunnaki and the new terrestrial species. That's where we get the religious institutions like the Pope and all these clowns pretending to be intermediaries between the human slaves and the gods. They're still pulling the same tricks to this day. We recall that all ancient people later claim to have received their knowledge directly from the gods, and many populations have developed traditions of initiation, the systems of knowledge, the system of knowledge transmission that confers the fundamental knowledge only to a few privileged individuals deemed worthy to receive it and able to understand and manage it. That's where you get the secret societies. Contrary to what was later said, however, this was about a very practical knowledge concerning the technical and cultural development of the people to be governed. Construction, cultivation, and breeding techniques, as well as mathematics, scientific, and astrological knowledge. These skills and abilities would have appeared to be quote-unquote magical in the eyes of the people, deliberately kept in ignorance. I've talked about that many times, how these gods would just display advanced technology, and then people that didn't understand technology would call it magic, and then they would worship the gods because they thought they could do magic. But really, it's just people with advanced technology. Same stuff's going on today. You got these people like Elon Musk, these billionaires with all this technology, and people literally like idolize and worship these people. Same stuff's going on. In short, this knowledge was nothing spiritual, but instead was a kind of practical knowledge, guaranteeing that the few could exercise power through control of those activities necessary for the development of the subjected human populations. The representatives of these gods were the ancient king priests, and they were also concerned with practical tasks. They would manage the gods' properties and wealth, and they would ruin their daily lives as masters of the house. In addition, they would also take care of those dwellings that were considered their worship places, those that we nowadays call the massive Templar centers. The king priests, above all, possessed astronomical knowledge, a basic science for Anunnaki, who needed to know precisely about the planetary orbits in order to plan their trips to and from their home planet. Some say that the astronomical knowledge of the ancient peoples arose from a need for them to be able to develop and practice agriculture, but we all know that the astronomical information needed to cultivate fields is very minor and confined to the events that affect, at most, the weather and possibly the moon cycles. In fact, they had the so-called tablets of destinies, astronomical maps which detailed the upcoming cosmological events. Scientists knew how to predict exactly what is happening in the sky, even several millennia in advance, including the locations of stars and planets at any given time, the eclipses, and the comets' movements. For the Anunnaki, the ability to predict the future was a vital necessity, as it was the prerequisite for long journeys into interplanetary space. Those who passed and controlled the tablets of destiny held the power. This astronomical knowledge was gradually transferred to the king priests, who thus acquired the ability to predict the future. In other words, they could predict what was going to happen concerning the movements of the stars and planets. This practical knowledge was perhaps the basis for the future astrology, a form of pseudo-knowledge that, after losing its truly scientific roots, tried to rebuild on a hypothetical basis with whatever memory was still preserved about a time when gods and their human representatives really knew how to predict the movements of objects in the heavens. Today, astrology has become a way to try and predict the future of individuals. How far we are from the scientific knowledge of the tablets of destiny is characterized by a thorough astrological knowledge necessary to travel long distances throughout the skies. Men attributed the gods as knowledge keepers also a characteristic of immortality. One can easily understand how this happened, considering that the Anunnaki's life was based on the yearly orbital cycle of Nibiru, which corresponds to 3,600 earthly years. Thus, their lifespan was also several thousand times longer than the atoms. Each of these gods lived for several human generations, and no Adam could witness the death of his god. Rather, their deeds would be handed down from generation to generation of ancestors. Such is the origin of the concept of God's immortality. In parentheses, it says, in a separate chapter, we will see how the Bible actually states that gods die just as men do. However, these figures have other human features. They were beings made of flesh and bone. In fact, they fought for power. Their wars were deadly. They produced winds that would make hair fall out, remove the skin, lead to death without apparent injury. Therefore, Enki and Enlil's disciples fought for power, and the biblical Abraham himself was involved in one of these wars, which was so devastating as to wipe out entire cities, as Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a story from Genesis 13 through 19. As these events, the leadership was transferred. Men were given knowledge necessary to go ahead alone. The purpose justifying their presence was achieved, and gods abandoned the earth. And ever since then, over the centuries, and in absence of direct contact, men began to develop a spiritual vision of divinity and to make assumptions about when the reunion between creature and creator would occur again. In fact, Nibiru returns every 3,600 years. Its elliptical orbit, making it cross with our solar system. This would actually make it a planet of our system. It would also be returning towards Earth, as it has repeatedly done in the past, after having reached in 1000 AD the farthest point from the sun. Nibiru today would have already traveled more than half the journeys back in its approach towards the inner planets, including Earth. All right, next section is entitled The Sumerians. The Sumerian culture appeared around 3800 BCE with an almost formed culture and complete with science, astronomical, mathematical, and linguistic skills. We can certainly assert that they knew the heliocentric system, the same as the one discovered thousands of years later by Galileo. Earth's motion and the size, the moon's distance, the stars' almost infinite distance. They knew about comets and predicted eclipses, being aware of their causes. They also knew about the very complex 26,000-year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon which, if predicted correctly, requires calculations to be made based on very detailed observation covering several centuries. The precession of the equinoxes. This expression indicates the celestial phenomenon caused by the oscillation or wobble of the Earth's axis, making a circular motion similar to that of a slowly spinning top. The oscillation results in an apparent demotion of the constellations in the celestial sphere. It happens because the imaginary line joining the ecliptic of spring and autumn equinoxes moves 1 degree approximately every 71 years. Each of the 12 signs of the zodiac that form the entire 360-degree sky arc covered a period of 2,160 years, corresponding to what astrology labeled as ages. Age of Aries, Age of Taurus, and so on. The complete cycle of 360 degrees thus requires a little less than 26,000 years. In parentheses, it says 2,160 times 12. Hence, it would have been impossible to observe and calculate. Regardless of this long period, called the quote-unquote Great Year, was known by many civilizations in various parts of the world, such as the Indus Valley, Egypt, Central America, and still today scholars wonder how a nomadic people of herders and farmers were able to calculate its duration. Might it have been might it have been of any use to the Anunnaki gods to calculate the orbital timing of their home planet and to plan their space travels that were inevitably very long? Perhaps the answer to many mysteries resides in accepting this possibility. The fact is, along with possessing some very advanced knowledge, the Sumerians seem to have suddenly appeared from out of nowhere. It should be stated here that other civilizations, such as the city of Jericho, the culture of Tel Gasol, the Turkish Ketal Huyuk, however you say that, Huyuk, for example, had also been centers of culture and civilizations for a long time. World order, in parentheses, it says. But this alone does not invalidate our theory, as they also could have been founded by Anunnaki. Sumerians invented writing, were experts in mathematics and astronomy, and conceived the earliest forms of parliamentary government. They also had the earliest schools, laws, and advanced social norms, many of which became part of the legislation system of the Old Testament people. These include protection for the weak, widowed, and orphaned. They adopted a brick firing system used to build ziggurats, namely multi-floor buildings housing a temple and an observatory for priests who, as mentioned, also were keen astronomers. The ziggurat's top floor was usually the god's dwelling, which was located at the top to allow easy access to the Anunnaki. Next part is entitled Religiosity. Sumerian religion, if we can really define it as such, was certainly polytheist. Indeed, the Anunnaki civilization, by partitioning power into various territories, therefore, gods were necessarily local deities. We have already said Anu, whose appearance dates back to the 4th millennium BC, was the lord of the empire. Compared to the divinities, his was a very evanescent, abstract figure, but he was not a creator. In fact, we knew Enki was the creator. Anu was also not the subject of a real constant cult like the other gods. His temple was located in the city of Uruk, or Erech in the Bible, and it was called Eanna, House of Heaven, in parentheses it says. The power of the gods and the kings chosen to represent them when authority was sent from heaven to earth came directly from Anu. This is why only rulers could communicate with him and not the subjects. Perhaps this is how the concept of remoteness and inaccessibility of God occurred in the theological elaborations developed over the following centuries. Anu would dwell in heaven far away on Nibiru, and according to Sumerian tales, he came on earth only once or maybe twice to see the work of his children. We have already read about them, Enlil, the Lord of above, and also of the air and the higher spheres, and then Enki was the Lord of the earth and the lower spheres and the water, the creator of man. A very important goddess was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, Astarte, Isis, Aphrodite, and Venus, depending on the cultures of the Middle East and the Mediterranean areas. The goddess of traveling on her flying machine, and for this reason was represented with a pilot suit and helmet. The concept of quote-unquote space must be considered as the foundation of everything that has to do with the divine. The Sumerian term for deities is Dingir, which actually refers to the meaning of celestial apparition, highlighting its brightness and shine, and then recalling the Lord's flying machines, which were bright and glittering. Their ideogram symbolized a star and represented a being from above. That sounds just like all those orb UFOs that people film with their cell phones to this day. I mean, they appear like all over the world. There's just so many of them. People film them with their cell phones and put them all over the internet now. And my friends have filmed a couple of them. We immediately note that this is exactly the same meaning as the biblical term Elohim, which means the Lord's from above. The term is usually but wrongly translated using the singular form to keep the concept of God's oneness. I think I've talked about this before on my Instagram, where it's in the English Bible, it says like, in the beginning, God created, but the original translation was Hebrew, and in Hebrew it's Elohim, so it says in the beginning Elohim created, so that's the gods created, it's plural. Indirect evidence. In this chapter, we have summarized those theories that are widely published with the sole purpose of addressing the following reading of certain passages from the Old Testament whose literal meaning recalls a very concrete material vision of God whose origin is non-terrestrial. To complete this presentation, however, we must mention here a series of statements and information from areas that are not related to alternative or UFO literature. Science and archaeoanthropology is the next section here. It says research of molecular biologists and geneticists on mitochondria date back to 300 through 250,000 BCE, with the appearance of the first female ancestor of all women, the so-called mitochondrial Eve, and all males whose mitochondria could only be transmitted by female eggs because they are too large to be contained in the spermatozoa. The amount of genetic material, or DNA, that distinguishes us from the two chimpanzee species closest to us, Paniscus and Troglodytes, sorry, these words are kind of tricky, is less than 2%, and yet evolutionists are questioning the extreme rapidity with which the hominid has progressed in its development compared to its cousins. There is no easy answer, and indeed the answer is not yet been found. Shall it be found in the hypothetical intervention of genetic engineering carried on by the Anunnaki, which would have accelerated the evolutionary process, promoting the one species rather than the other? If you ask me, in my opinion, yes, absolutely. That's very obvious. Professor Umberto Galimberti, a teacher of philosophy and history at the University of Venice, writes that at some point in development, the human beings have undergone a sort of devolution, a break in the evolutionary process resulting from the loss of stabilization furnished, as for all other animals, by instinct. Since then, man has never had a specific relationship with any particular environment, but had to unfold to the world and build a livable environment. Man is open to all environments because by now he is appropriate to none. Seemingly, this needs to build a world by changing the environment would have produced consciousness through, or and then in parentheses it says, though we note that Galimberti did not provide an explanation about the origin of the moment when man lost its instinctual stabilization. Recent archaeological discoveries have dated back to the start of the artistic production from 35 to 77,000 years ago. 300 pieces of red and yellow this word ochre, or ochre, as I believe I say that, discovered in Zambia, even move its beginning to 350 to 400,000 years ago. 28 bone tools and thousands of fragments of iron oxide, in parentheses, a derivative of ochre, discovered in South Africa, show that more than 200,000 years ago, man worked his objects for purpose that transcended mere utilitarian function they were finished, decorated, polished, and carved with distinguishing signs. Dr. Stephen Schreier, director of the Project of Human Genetics Mapping at Baylor College of Medicine's Human Genome Center in Houston in 2001, wrote that in the human genome there are at least 200 genes that appear to be foreign to the whole heritage that unites men to other vertebrates. These genes do not even belong to invertebrates and have therefore been acquired after the evolutionary ladder in a completely inexplicable way. Tim Crow, teacher of psychiatry at Oxford University, a member of the Medical Research Council in England, believes that about 150,000 years ago, mankind made a quote-unquote evolutionary leap, acquiring the ability to speak due to translocation of a gene on the Y chromosome. Next part is entitled Philosophy, Mythology. Giovanni Reale, professor of history of philosophy at the Catholic University in Milan, explains the origin of the concept of a quote-unquote soul developed in the Greek world in the period between Homer and Plato, and reports some very interesting statements with reference to the relationship between men and gods in Homer's world. He underlines that the gods have a full range of human vices as well as an ambivalent character. In examining the triad of Zeus, Apollo, and Athena, we see that Zeus does not keep promises. He can be easily deceived. Apollo gets directly involved in battle, reminding Diomedes that he should not fight with the gods because he is not the same as the race of men trudging on the ground. He also recalls two passages from the Iliad that we find very interesting. It's if seen in relation to the hypothesis that gods were people made of flesh and blood. During the Trojan War, they could actually still be on Earth, since one of them had established a covenant with Moses in almost the same time when the events described in the Iliad took place. Elena looks dreadfully like the immortal goddesses. Poseidon distinguished himself as the prophet of Calchas, and then when he speaks to Ajax, Ajax says, "This is not Calchas." I immediately watched behind him his footprints and footsteps as he was going. Gods are easily recognized. Next section, it says Sumerology. Giovanni Pettinato, professor in Sumerology at the University of LA in Rome, writes, so far, Sumerian epics were considered to have no historical confirmation and were assumed to be only a projection into the past of socio-political realities current in the third dynasty of Ur, which is 2150 BC. The quotation compels us to review all our models of society and management of power. He also says that there has been long a habit of considering sizable buildings to be placed or to be places of worship, that theoretical constructs have been articulated on the basis of this misinterpretation. These have now proved groundless, reviewed in the light of new discoveries and new knowledge. A brief concluding observation. The assumptions we made are certainly fascinating, but above all, they are supported by correspondences in text that were considered beyond any suspicion, like the Old Testament, which was inspired directly by God. There are many supporters who also detractors of this reconstruction of humanity's origin, and they are mainly located in the Catholic Church, the organization that stands to lose the most if it was confirmed that the Bible has little to do with the religious doctrine it is supposedly based on. We will later see how the church is forced to admit that the Bible editors knew of these people, But first, we want to unveil here some additional information. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, the two probes NASA launched into the infinity of space, besides containing images and sounds from Earth, also include a record on which greetings are spoken in 55 languages. And the first greeting was recorded in Sumerian. Well, that's interesting. The next little section is entitled "And Methodological Statement." In the following chapters, according to the free thinking to which the Bible pertains, we will deal with the issue of analyzing the Old Testament in its literal translation. Therefore, you will read the Hebrew text of the first series of passages from the Bible, and then its translation word by word, graphically representing the correspondence between terms. We will thus find out what they do not want to tell us. Pretty interesting stuff. Okay, I'm gonna take a break here, and we'll continue in the next video.